there were statements, attributed to Mr. Al-Jubair just a couple of days, 3 days ago, about arming, the rebels, or what he called the moderate rebels, with lethal weapons and so on. So, are you on the same page in this thing? Would you be willing to arm the moderate rebels with more lethal weapons and maybe supply them with, surface-to-air missiles and so on that can bring Russian and Syrian airplanes down?
What we want to see is a meaningful cessation of hostilities that can get us back to political discussions, because we still believe, hang on guys, we still believe in a political solution to this. And as a government, I'm not going to speak for other governments, but I can speak for ours. We continue to examine a range of options that are available to us going forward in Syria. But as you and I speak here today, Saeed, nothing has changed about the fact that we continue to believe the best option is a political one, a diplomatic solution. And that is what Secretary Kerry's focus is on. That will be a major topic of discussion when he meets with the foreign minister this afternoon, and that is what we're continuing to work towards.
So just one more. The Russian foreign minister said that the only thing that is standing between a permanent ceasefire in Syria and is the fact that Nusra remains in Aleppo. So if they leave Aleppo, we will have a permanent ceasefire. Do you have any comment on that?
I would say the only thing that stands between where we are now and a permanent enduring ceasefire in Syria is Bashar al-Assad and his supporters. Now, we recognize al-Nusra is a spoiler. We recognize the concerns about commingling. I have talked about this ad nauseum. But it is within the regime's power to put their airplanes on the ground and keep them there, and to keep their forces out of Aleppo and from killing innocent civilians and destroying infrastructure. It is totally within the Russian government's power and authority to do that with their own aircraft. That's what the problem has been. Look, you and I just got into a back and forth over the last few hours, where I agree with you. We've seen a reduction in the violence. Why is that, Saeed? Why? Because the Russians and Assad have decided that they're not going to fly as much. So it's absolutely within their power, and we've said that from the very beginning.
Is the U.S. fighting al-Nusra in Syria at this time?
You were going to explain why you were going to ask the question.
No, that is actually a very simple question. I mean,
I thought you were going to ask the question and then tell me why you were asking me the question.
The question is the U.S. fighting al-Nusra in Syria at this time?
Our efforts militarily in Syria, as I said to Dave, is against ISIS, against Daesh. Now, there has been, I think, at least one, maybe more. I don't know. You'd have to check with my Pentagon colleagues. But we know al-Nusra. They're outside the cessation of hostilities. They're also a UN-designated terrorist group. They're al-Qaeda in Syria, is how we refer to them. And I know that from a unilateral U.S. perspective, when we have had information that led us to take action because of plotting we knew they were doing, we did that. But the primary effort militarily in Syria is against Daesh.
Does the U.S.
You said you only had one question.
And actually, you confirmed that. Basically, my other, the one that prompted the question, so it's redundant right now, not necessary to ask. Does the U.S. have a more broad question? So in Mosul, the U.S. has a strategy to fight ISIL there, which is to support, to train and equip Iraqi forces. In Aleppo, let's say with Russia out of the picture, I'm assuming, and I'm actually certain, that the U.S. wouldn't do the same for Syrian forces. And I'm wondering, does the U.S. have a strategy of its own to defeat al-Nusra in Syria that does not involve Russia?
We did have a strategy, if you might remember. If you go back to September 9th in Geneva, when Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Kerry talked, and we struck a deal, right, an arrangement where if we got 7 days of reduced violence, we would stand up what was called a joint implementation center, by which we would share information with the Russian military, designed specifically to cooperate against al-Nusra, specifically al-Nusra. I mean, and Daesh. Daesh was mentioned in there, but al-Nusra was specifically named as a target of those kinds of activities that we would be willing to cooperate and share information with the Russians on. We didn't get there. So there was a strategy, and it was implemented. It was written down on September 9th, and you can go back and look at the agreement and see that. We just couldn't get there because the Russians weren't willing to meet their commitments.
The Turkish forces that are just north of Aleppo now and getting a bit closer there, Turkish-backed FSA, and they've also got U.S. Special Forces with them. Are they part of the coalition against ISIS, as is broadly understood, the FSA forces north of Aleppo now?
I'm wary to talk about specific military matters. That there are, and I don't have perfect granularity on every group that's fighting, but the groups that I think it's safe to assume that groups that we are supporting, whether it's through air support or advising and assisting on the ground, but it's safe to assume that if we're supporting those groups, that they are considered to be part of the coalition against Daesh.
Yeah, the FSA forces are getting closer to Al-Bab, they're getting closer to northern Aleppo. At some point, they're going to bump up against regime forces and or Russian forces backing them. It would be inappropriate for them to clash.
Well, but I don't want you to mix here the fight against Daesh and the support that we're giving to some forces on the ground are to fight
That was
Daesh.
in the premise of my question, that they're fighting ISIS, and you've welcomed the advances they've made, but those advances are bringing them closer to other forces with which they are not friendly, but which are, well, would be, if the ceasefire was reinstalled, would be party to a ceasefire. Do you have any concerns that these forces that you're backing now against ISIS are going to wind up with a frontline?
Well, we're backing forces to fight ISIS, to fight Daesh. That's the goal. We're not doing that activity to get involved and embroiled in the civil war. And what we want, and what we said over and over again, is we want every member of the coalition, be it a state or not a state, if you're fighting in the coalition against Daesh, just to focus on that common enemy, because we all face that common enemy. But I really don't want to get into hypotheticals and speculating about the dynamics of the battlefield in and around Aleppo. Our focus militarily in Syria remains focused on the fight against Daesh and only on the fight against Daesh.
But you would give advice to forces that you were backing that their task remains to
The
fight
advice
ISIS.
that we give is in keeping with the fight against Daesh and only Daesh.
Thank you. Just more specific question about the Turkish Air Force bombing the Kurds in Afrin. It looks like the Syrian Kurdish forces, also Turkey-backed Free Syrian forces, both of them are racing to take over or reach to Al-Bab, a city near Aleppo. Do you have a position to which groups to take over the Al-Bab?
Do I have a position on what groups should take over Al-Bab?
Because they are clashing with each other right now. They are trying to block each other right now.
I mean, I'm aware of the clashes. We're monitoring it, as I think Mark said, closely. We've called on all parties to refrain from uncoordinated movements and to focus, as I said earlier, on the common enemy. And the common enemy is Daesh. Both these Syrian forces and Turkey can and should operate inside the coalition, which is to focus on Daesh and not one another, and that's what we want to see. But as I said, we also don't want to see any uncoordinated movements, and these strikes would qualify as uncoordinated movements.
So on that Al-Bab question, do you have a position? Because each of the groups trying to reach to Al-Bab, that is the main...
I said our position is we want them to focus on the fight against Daesh.